Today, we're going to conclude the subject that we started the first of this month in the subject of homosexuality. We have tried to be fair and tell both sides of the issue, and today in our concluding segment, we're going to look again at part of the homosexual argument and the propaganda that they have portrayed to show that it is not accurate and that it is misleading people and construing and perverting the facts in order that they might be able to further their agenda. Now, last week we showed you that they said that 10% of our nation is of the homosexual persuasion. That's false. Database includes this 10% figure comes from a 1948 flawed Kinsey research figure. Kinsey was a did some sexual studies, and this 1948, now think about this, 1948, they went all the way back to 1948 to get this 10%. Well, how did they arrive at this 10%? Well, the database included a high percentage of prison inmates that were known sex offenders. When they took all the statistics, they included the high percentage of prison inmates who were in prison for sex. Convicted criminals comprised a full 25% of Kinsey's male sample, compared to less than 1% of the total U.S. population. Now look at those figures, those are accurate. They used 25% of the male sample from convicted criminals and only used 1% of the total U.S. population. Now, brother, you're going to get a skewed number when you use that kind of statistic. That's a stacked rating. That's a stacked and perverted conclusion because it's not a fair assessment of the total population. Newsweek in 293 said ideology, not sound science, has perpetrated a 1 in 10 myth. In nearly half the century since Kinsey, no survey has come close to duplicating his findings. Now this was in 1993 in Newsweek. They said that this was a 1 in 10 myth. That's a myth. No survey, no poll has even come close to duplicating the flawed Kinsey report. Again, why do they use it? Because it furthers the homosexual agenda propaganda. They want you to believe that there's a 10% of our population that are homosexual. That is just not so. And there's not a statistic, there's not a poll, and there's not a survey that's even come close to that number in all the surveys that have been taken in the last 50 years. Men aged 20 to 39, 1.1% exclusively homosexual in the past 10 years. Alan Gruber sponsored that study. 1.1% between the ages of 20 and 39 were homosexual. Less than 3% admit to being gay in the 1992 New York Times post-election poll. Other figures, 2% in 1970, 3.1 in 1975 through 78, 1.1 in 1992, and gay and lesbian couples, 1% census in 1993. Excuse me. All of them far below the 10% myth. The most widely accepted study of sexual practices in the United States in the National Health and Social Life Survey, NHSLS, the NASLS found that 2.8% of the male and 1.4% of the female population identify themselves as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. This amounts to nearly 4 million openly gay men and 2 million who identify as lesbian. This was from the 2003 Supreme Court case between Lawrence and Texas and was part of the court brief of 31 homosexual and pro-sexual groups. 2.8%. 4 million men, 2 million women. We have over 320 million people in our country. 10%, that's a lie That's a myth. That's propaganda. The Gallup poll of 2014. 37% of homosexuals are that way because of upbringing and environment. 42% of Americans believe gays are born that way. Their message is resonating. 60% of Americans think we should recognize gay marriages. This is in 2014. All I'm showing you is their message is resonating because it is a one-sided conversation. They're making it a civil rights issue. They're making it an issue of their rights. They're not looking at the statistics. They're not looking at the other argument because they won't let the other argument be told. If you oppose this, then you are going to be silenced. You're going to be marginalized. Excuse me, you're going to be marginalized because they don't want that dissenting voice to be heard. And so they're going to put you in the worst possible light in order that would drown out the words and your statements and the position that you have in order that it might not be told. Why? Because they want this one-sided conversation. They want people to look and be convinced by these skewed polls that they've used since 1948. 71% of Americans think marriage is not a lifetime commitment. Well, that's not news, because 1 out of 2 marriages today ends in divorce. That's not because the marriage institution is weakened. That's not because it's not a good institution. That's because the people that are in it are not committed to one another. Again, that just shows the lack of morality among our nation. The morality of this country is in shambles, not just on the homosexual front, but on adultery, upon fornication, pedophiles, bestiality. And that stuff's coming. And you think it's not, it is, it's coming. Because they're going to use the same basic argument, that they have the right to their own sexual orientation. No matter how disrespectful and how disgusting it is to you, they believe they have a right to be able to act upon it. You going to accept that? I guess time will tell. We are told today that 1.8 of the population are homosexual. This is based on a 2013 report. Based on the 2013 NAIS that we just mentioned, from adults 18 and over, 96.6% of adults identified themselves as straight. 1.6 identified as gay or lesbian, and 0.7 identified themselves as bisexual. The remaining 1.1 of the adults identified as something else. 0.2 stated, I don't know the answer, and 0.04 refused to provide an answer. 0.06. Do you get this? 1.8. Now, are we talking about the majority of our population? No, we're not talking about the majority of our population. We're not even talking about double digits. We're talking about less than 2%. Less than 2% of our nation practice and perpetrate and widely commit to this sexual orientation. Why should that percentage be allowed to dictate the rules of this discussion and how this message is going to be conducted? Because the media has put themselves in their back pocket. And so they have allowed this discussion to be very one-sided. But these are the facts, ladies and gentlemen. It is not 10%. It has never been 10%, nor do I believe it will ever be 10%. It is less than 2% of the American population that practice and participate in this type of sexual living. Less than 2%. 6% of Americans think homosexual relations between consenting adults should be legal. That's up from 43 in 1977, 47 in 1989, and 54 in 2001. Again, the homosexual propaganda machine has got their message out. 88% of Americans believe gays should receive equal opportunity provisions in their workplace, just like any other minority, and that's up from 80% in 2001. Concerning marriage, 48% for and 52% against granting gays the privilege and rights of marriage. See, that's much different than those who think between consenting adults it should be legal. Now, I want to clarify something here. This is not a civil rights issue. Now, when black Americans were mistreated, not allowed to vote, treated as property and slaves, that was a black mark on our country. That was a civil rights issue. A person could not in his life, he could not do anything that he was born black. He was born black by no choice of his own. He was born of black parents, and so he became black. And that, because of the color of his skin, he should not be discriminated against. That's a civil rights issue. When women didn't have the right to vote, when they didn't have equal say in political matters, and they didn't have any rights, that was wrong. Why? Because a woman can't help, she's a woman. And you were discriminating her just based upon her gender. That's a civil rights issue. Homosexuality is not the same kind of issue. It is not something you're born with. It's not something genetically done to them. It is a chosen lifestyle. It is something they choose to do. It is something of a learned behavior. And therefore it is not a civil rights violation. That is the propaganda machine ginning up, and that's what they're basing their argument on, that it's a civil rights violation. It is not. It has never been, nor will it ever be a civil rights issue. It is something that a person chooses to participate in. It is a learned behavior. It is not something that they're discriminated against because they can't do anything about it. That is just a false straw man argument and cannot be sustained by the evidence and even by the polls. And we're going to see even by their own argument. Now, do you believe homosexual behavior is a sin? Now, among those persons acquainted with someone who has same-sex attraction, 44% believe homosexual behavior is sin, and 49% do not. Notice, 44% believe it's a sin. 44%. Now, why is their voice being drowned out according to those who believe by religious formulation? And you notice here, by Catholics, Protestants, born-again, evangelical, fundamentalists, you're going to see that the fundamentalists is way out here in 79% because they're more conservative. Catholics, they've kind of given in to 39%. Why? Well, because they have so much of the problem within their own clergy. And so again, some of the religions are caving in, but that doesn't change God's law, and that doesn't change God's book. Now, in 1977, 56% believed that homosexuality was caused by upbringing and environment, to 13% believing that homosexuals were born that way. That was in 1977. 26 years later, in 2003, the percentage of Americans accepting the genetic argument has more than doubled to 38%, while the percentage of agreeing that homosexuality is an environmentally cause has dropped to 44%. What does that mean? That just means that the homosexual agenda and the propaganda machine has been very good about getting their message out and drowning out the opposition. They've done a very good job at that, and they need to be given credit for that. But that's not an honorable discussion because it's a one-sided proposition. Now, let's look at some of their own activists in what they say. Nature or nurture? Dean Hammer, he's a gay researcher. We knew that genes were only part of the answer. We assumed the environment also played a role in sexual orientation, as it does in most, if not all, behaviors. Homosexuality is not purely genetic. Environmental factors play a role. There is not a single master gene that makes people gay. I don't think we will ever be able to predict who will be gay. Again, not a single master gene that makes people gay. Now, here's a person who's looking at the evidence who is a homosexual themselves but cannot find the evidence for the genetic link. Simon LeVay, brain differences. It's important to stress that what I didn't find, I did not prove that homosexuality is genetic or find a genetic cause for being gay. I didn't show that gay men are born that way, the most common mistake people make in interpreting my work. Nor did I locate a gay center in the brain. Since I looked at the adult brains, we don't know if the difference I found were there at birth or they appeared later. And so, Mr. LeVay's research has been used as to prop the argument that they found a genetic link. He says no. He says, I did not prove that homosexuality is genetic. He said, I didn't prove it. My findings don't prove it. And again, he's just being honest. There is no genetic link on who is gay and who's not gay. Then you have Camille Paglia, lesbian activist and writer. No one is born gay. The mere ideal that is possible is a flimsy fabrication of sloppy journalists and a moral queer activist. Any person, male or female, who cannot feel the sexual allure of the opposite sex has been traumatized by some early combination of social circumstances. Again, it's a fabrication. There is no genetic link. There is nothing that makes a homosexual against his will. It makes a lesbian against her will. It is a learned behavior. It is a sexual orientation of choice. Inherited traits. You know what? You have tall parents. You may inherit height. Maybe if your father and mother were athletic, then you would inherit the traits of athletics, or hand-eye coordination. If they're very athletic, if they were very into sports, then you might inherit those traits. Those are things that you can inherit. But competitiveness is an instilled trait. If you learn to be competitive, that's an instilled trait. That's something that you must nurture. That's something that you must learn and you must work upon. Hard worker. That's something you have to develop. You know, you can be given an example of hard work. You can be shown that example and influence all your life. But you're going to have to take that upon yourself. You're going to have to instill that in your life, in the like sports. I wasn't born to like baseball. I love baseball. My dad, he watched it, but he didn't really care about it. My mother wasn't interested in it until many years later after I grew up. But you see, that was something I learned to love. I'll give you another example. I love pizza, but I wasn't born with a pizza in my hand. I didn't pass it on from my parents. My dad, he doesn't really care for it. He'll eat it, but he doesn't really care for it. You see, that was something that was instilled trait. That was something I learned to accept. Sensitivity, you know. My mother's very sensitive, and I'm sensitive. I have a very tender heart. I get that from my mother. Melancholy disposition. There's some people who have a very melancholy disposition. Why? Because it may be an inherited trait. It could be because of hormone levels that we're a little bit more sensitive than other people. But then you have instilled traits, environment of right and wrong. We determine that. We learn what's right and wrong. The role models. We have role models. Who do we look to as examples and influences in our life? Our association with people, our activities. All those instill traits in us. I'll give you an example. Why is a person prejudiced? A young man in South Carolina that gunned down 9 black people in a church. How did he hate blacks so much and become a racist? How did he do that? He wasn't born that way. He wasn't created that way. He learned that behavior. That was something that was learned by his environment, by his association, by the choices he made, by the things that he read, by the things that he did, the people he hung around with. All those things were instilled traits that he instilled in himself because of environmental characteristics. Again, he wasn't born hating them. You're not born being a prejudiced person. You have to learn prejudice. You're not born with hating people. You learn to hate people. Those are instilled traits that we learn by choice. Tendency towards alcoholism, pedophilia, anger, gambling, violence, etc. does not make them acceptable behavior. If you were born of alcoholic parents, then you're going to have the tendency to drift towards alcoholism. If you come from parents who are angry, or you come from parents who abused you, why are the majority of children who come from abused homes, why do they become abused parents? Because of the environment that they lived in, because of the things that they were exposed to. Okay, you can have a tendency to go that way, but you don't have to repeat the behavior. You'll have a tendency to go that way, but you can resist it. I have a good friend in Ohio whose father was an alcoholic. 3 of her brothers died before they were 45 years old because they took up the bottle and drugs and destroyed their lives before they were 45. She has a sister in California that followed the same role. She has an older brother that gone the same route and is very much a drinker. But my friend, who is also part of that family, the 6th child, she wants nothing to do with it. You'd have to hold her down and pour it down her throat. She had the same influences. She had it all around her, but she chose not to do it. Why? Because you can choose. You don't have to become a product of your environment. Just because something's wrong does not mean it's not your fault because you follow it. Because we come to be a rational human being and we can make a decision to go in a different way in our life. If truth be known, we all have tendency towards something we should not do. Maybe you have a tendency to eat too much. Maybe you have a tendency to use bad language. Maybe you have a tendency to not be very compassionate or not to be very friendly. We all have tendencies, but we do not have to indulge them. We do not have to accept them. We can change. We can monitor our behavior. The challenge of life is to control our behavior according to God's standard, and that applies to homosexuality as well. Now, I'm going to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. I quit making the argument, and I quit trying to reject the argument that a homosexual may have desire for another man, or a woman may have the desire for another woman. Now, I don't fully understand that. I don't know how that happened. It could be environmental, it could be association, it could be traumatization that's happened in their life. I don't know. But they may have that desire. But they would have to fight and resist that desire, just like I would have to resist as a heterosexual that had been married for almost 32 years, and I saw a pretty woman, and she came on to me, and she might be attractive, and I might have an attraction to her, but I would have to resist that. I would have to not give in to that, because to do so would be a violation of my marriage commitment and also be a violation of God's law. Now, I might have the desire, but I'd have to say no because it's sinful. And so will the homosexual, and so will the lesbian. Even if they have that desire, they must resist it. And I know they can resist it. Why? Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. Chapter 10 and verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape that you might be able to bear it. Now, you might be tempted to go on that path. You might be tempted to follow that lifestyle. But God will make a way out, but you'll have to take it. You have to draw the line and you have to cross it. That is a learned behavior. It's a learned behavior, seen in that is condemned in the Bible. It cannot be something you're born with because it is condemned in the Bible. Same with any sin, whether you're talking about drinking, fornication, gambling, pornography, all of it is learned behavior. You get addicted because you make poor choices. Testimony of gay and lesbian community tell you it has to do with environment, it has to do with traumatization. There's a lot of factors that factor into it, but there is no genetic link. There's been no evidence of it. There's been no gene found, and the percentages of people involved in this lifestyle is much lower than that which is professed by the homosexual community. Now, they want to make this a civil rights issue. They want to make that they have some rights. Well, you know what? Homosexuals do have some rights. If at the end of this lesson today, at the end of this study, I want to give you the homosexual Bill of Rights, because they do have some rights. Number one, they have the right to hear the gospel. You know why? Because they're part of God's creation. God sent the apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. They deserve to hear the gospel. Number two, they have the right to know that God does not regard homosexuality or lesbianism as an alternate lifestyle. God says it's perversion, He says it's abomination, it's of a debased mind, it's not fitting, and it's against nature, and it's sinful, and they have a right to know that. They also have a right to know that such conduct is considered sinful by God, and He will not accept it, 1 Corinthians 6. They have a right to know that they will suffer in their own bodies and personalities the consequence of their sin if they choose to participate in that sinful lifestyle. Romans chapter 1 verse 27 tells us that. Number 5, they need to know that in the Bible they are called dogs because of their sin. Not literal dogs, they're called dogs because they're on the outside looking in the glimpse we have of heaven in Revelation 22. Number 6, to know their companions, husband or wife, can put them away for sinful conduct. It's sexual immorality. I've known of a number of cases in the church over the years where men and women have committed adultery. And again, when they committed adultery, they committed it with the same sex. Man left his wife for another man. A woman left her husband for another woman. Just had a case recently, a friend of ours whose wife left because she went off with another woman. That's sexual immorality. That's cause to separate in God's sight. And I know that you can repent of the sin. Man can repent of the sin of homosexuality. I know he can because 1 Corinthians 6:11 said that some did. You can repent of the sin. You can get out of the lifestyle. You can make that choice. Number 8, you know that homosexuality is not a disease, but a chosen sinful way of life that can be overcome. Homosexuals have recovered. They have left that lifestyle and been productive in heterosexual relationships. It can be done. Don't let the homosexual community fool you that it's something they can't help and they're that way because they were born that way. That's a lie. Number 9, know that they were not born as homosexual, that is not an accepted and normal lifestyle before the Almighty God, Romans 1:26. And last, know even if one would have the desire, it would have to be rejected and denied. God would help them have the ability to reject the temptation. We just read 1 Corinthians 10:13. Now that's their rights. That's the homosexual rights by the God Almighty who created male and female. And in conclusion this morning, I want you to know that I do not hate any homosexual. I do not hate any lesbian. I have no ill will against them. My opposition and my position is based solely on what God's Word says and what God's Word tells me that I must teach and preach to all people. And so it's a learned behavior. It's not a genetic link. It's not something they have to do. It's something they choose to do. My hope and my prayer is that people will listen to both sides of this discussion, that they will be honest with themselves, and they will see what God's position is on this. And if God Almighty condemns it, then it absolutely cannot be something that they cannot help. There would be an unjust God who would cause one to be lost, to live in a lifestyle that they had no control over. Ladies and gentlemen, homosexuality is a sin. It's against nature. It's against God. And such conduct will cost someone their soul in eternity if it's not repented of. That's the truth.